I live in a small 4-story apartment complex. I used to have a roommate, but they moved out a few months ago. I decided to stay in the apartment instead of finding a new place. Most of the other residents were older couples, but I'd never really interacted with them. We all kept to ourselves, which suited me fine. One night, I got home late, around 11 p.m. As I walked up the stairs to my room, it was quiet. But when I turned the corner into the hallway, a man was standing at my door. He noticed me immediately. Before I could react, he started apologizing and saying he'd mixed up the doors. He turned around and went into the apartment across from mine. I'd never seen him before. But since he lived across from me, I figured he might have accidentally gotten the doors confused, especially if he had just moved in. It was still weird, though. I didn't know why he would be standing outside someone's door if he thought it was his. And why, when he saw me, did he suddenly realize he was at the wrong door? Whatever the case, I went inside, locked the door, and tried to figure out what had just happened. As I sat on my couch, trying to process the encounter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The man's behavior was strange, and it was difficult to understand his intentions. Was he simply lost or confused? Was he trying to break into my apartment? Or was he just a harmless stranger who had made a mistake? I tried to rationalize the situation, to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why had he chosen to stand outside my door, rather than knocking on it? Why had he apologized so quickly, as if he knew he had done something wrong? And why had he seemed so relieved when he realized he was at the wrong door? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if he had been watching me, waiting for an opportunity to enter my apartment. The thought was terrifying, and it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as a product of my overactive imagination, but the fear was real. As I lay in bed that night, trying to sleep, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. The man's presence, his sudden appearance, his strange behavior, it all seemed so deliberate, so calculated. I was terrified of the thought that he might return, that he might try to break into my apartment again. I knew I was being irrational, but I couldn't help it. My mind was racing with all sorts of possibilities, all of them terrifying. I tried to calm myself down, to focus on something else, but it was no use. The fear was too strong. It was late, and I was tired, so maybe I should have been more worried. But I just didn't have the energy to think about it. I made a quick meal, sat on the couch, and watched some TV. About 30 minutes later, I heard something outside my door. It was a quiet shuffling sound, like someone was up against the door. I got up, listened, and then opened it. Nobody was there. I stepped into the hallway and looked down, but didn't see anyone. I heard footsteps going down the stairs. I went back in and closed the door. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I started wondering if the man had leaned against my door to listen to what was going on inside my apartment. That would explain the shuffling sound and why he left as soon as I started walking up again. I could have been imagining the worst-case scenario, but I was definitely more shaken for the rest of the night. I didn't get into bed until 1 a.m., but I fell asleep soon after. Nothing else happened that night or the next morning. I went to work and got back to the apartment around 11 p.m. I was a bit more cautious this time. I walked up the stairs and looked down the hallway, but nobody was at the door. For some reason, I got a strange feeling seeing the hallway empty. I didn't know why. I quickly went inside and locked the door behind me. But when I turned around, I was face to face with the man from the night before. He was standing in the doorway to my bedroom, telling me to be quiet and do as he says. He tried to direct me into the living room. I turned around, tried to open the door, but the man grabbed my arm and pulled me back. Just as I got the door open, I yelled as loud as I could. He tried to cover my mouth, but he was unsuccessful. He let go, and I ran down the stairs. I heard him leaving as well. I went straight to my car, drove away, and called the police. When they got there, the man was gone, of course. I told them he lived in a room across from mine, but it turned out to be a vacant unit. The man, whoever he was, didn't even live in the building. I don't know how he got into the building or into both mine and the vacant room, but clearly, he had access he shouldn't have. What he wanted to do by breaking into my apartment and waiting for me is something I hope to never find out firsthand. With him still out there, though, all I can do is pray he wasn't targeting me in particular. This happened a few months ago. I'm 32, living alone in a small house. It was my day off, so I was home relaxing and cooking dinner. Around 4 p.m., someone knocked on the door. I went to the front, and there was a man standing on my porch. Behind him was a small gray van parked on the curb. I opened the door and asked if I could help him. The man hesitated for a moment before responding, his voice monotone and his expression blank. He said he was doing free home inspections in the neighborhood and wanted to offer me a free inspection for my house. However, something about his demeanor seemed off. His eyes were vacant, his movements were slow and deliberate, and he spoke as if he were reading from a script. He didn't make any eye contact, and he didn't smile or show any emotion. I was immediately put on edge by his behavior. It was as if he were a robot, programmed to deliver a specific message and then move on. I had never encountered anyone like him before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I declined his offer politely, but he persisted. He tried to convince me that it would be a great opportunity to get my house evaluated by a professional. He even offered to do the inspection right then and there. I told him I wasn't interested, but he continued to press me. Finally, I had to be more assertive. I told him that I was not interested in a free home inspection and that I wanted him to leave. He seemed surprised by my firmness, but he eventually turned around and walked away. As I watched him walk back to his van, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He had seemed so out of place, so unnatural. It was as if he were a ghost, a phantom that had appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as quickly. I couldn't understand why he had chosen to target me, or what his intentions had been. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. I was still shaken by the encounter, and I couldn't stop thinking about the man and his strange behavior. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there was nothing to worry about. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. They said an officer would arrive in a few minutes. I watched the man, and about a minute later, he walked off my porch and into his van. He drove away just before the officer arrived. It was unfortunate timing, but I was glad he was gone. I gave the officer a description and went back to enjoying my night. A couple of hours passed without incident. It was 8 o'clock or 9 p.m., and I was resting in my bed on my phone. Through the open window, I heard the rattling sound of an old vehicle pulling up and parking outside my house. I heard someone getting out, so I quickly went to the window. It was the same old van, but I didn't see the man. He must have rushed away as soon as he got out. I quickly got my phone and called 911. As I hung up, I heard a loud thump downstairs. I felt the walls shake, and I knew the man was trying to break in. I opened my bedroom door, went into the hallway, and listened. It was eerily quiet. I walked down a few steps and looked around. All the lights were off, but I saw the curtains by one of the windows swaying in the wind. The window had been forced open. My body tensed up as I tried to control myself. The man was likely somewhere in my house. I carefully and quietly went back upstairs and hid in the bedroom closet. I didn't hear anything until a few minutes later when 2 officers knocked on the front door. I ran downstairs and let them in. They didn't hear anyone trying to run away. It only took a few seconds for the officers to find the man hiding behind the kitchen counter. He gave up without a fight. Disturbingly, he was holding a large hammer, which he had used to force open the window. When they tested him at the station, he wasn't high or drunk, but he still had that eerily vacant personality. He never said his intentions, almost like he didn't even remember what had happened. It's hard for me not to think about the other ways this could have gone. If I had gone to sleep and not heard him get in, I might have come to a horrible fate in the morning, or possibly not even been given the luxury of waking up. I was off work one night, relaxing at home. My roommate was out of town, and I'm a bit of a night owl, so I enjoyed staying up late. It was around 12 a.m., and I was sipping on a beer while watching TV. I heard a faint sound coming from above. At first, I ignored it. But after a few seconds, I realized it couldn't have been my roommate. I looked up at the ceiling, muted the TV, and tried to listen again. A few seconds passed, and there was nothing. The sound was so soft, and with the TV on, I wasn't sure what it was or where it came from. I considered getting up to investigate, but I was feeling lazy and not worried enough to bother. Instead, I opened the mini fridge, grabbed another beer, and took a few sips. Before I could unmute the TV, I heard the same thump sound above me. I looked up at the ceiling and heard subtle footsteps slowly walking in the room above. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that someone was in my apartment, upstairs. My body went numb. I got up from the couch, went to the stairs, and stood at the bottom. I could hear a thumping sound echoing through the hallway. I called out my roommate's name, knowing it couldn't be him, but hoping somehow it was. When there was no reply, I started scaling the stairs, flicking on the lights to the upstairs hallway. It was empty, but the door at the far end was open. It was my roommate's room, but I was sure I had closed it the day he left. I never went in there, so there was no reason for it to be open. My heart was pounding as I walked through the hallway and looked inside the room. It looked the same as when he left. Everything was clean and in place. I checked every room upstairs, but found nothing. I was starting to feel a sense of dread. Whoever was in my apartment was clearly trying to avoid being detected. They were moving quietly, cautiously, as if they were hunting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger, that I was being watched. I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Who was in my apartment? What were they doing? Were they planning to harm me? The possibilities were endless, and each one was more terrifying than the last. I tried to focus on the present moment, to stay calm and alert. I knew that if I panicked, I would only make the situation worse. I needed to be prepared for anything. I didn't sleep that night and spent the next couple of days on edge, waiting for my roommate to get home. The experience had left me feeling shaken and vulnerable. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that I was no longer safe in my own home. The thought of the intruder lurking in the shadows, their intentions unknown, filled me with dread. I tried to distract myself, to focus on other things, but the fear was too strong. I couldn't stop replaying the events of that night in my mind, the sound of the footsteps above me, the feeling of being watched. It was a constant reminder of the danger that had lurked in my apartment, a danger that I had narrowly escaped. I was grateful that I had not confronted the intruder, that I had chosen to stay hidden and call the police. I knew that if I had confronted them, the outcome could have been very different. I could have been hurt, or even worse. The thought of what might have happened if I had not taken those precautions was terrifying. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that danger can lurk anywhere, even in the most seemingly safe places. It made me realize that I needed to be more vigilant, more aware of my surroundings. I needed to take steps to protect myself, to make my home more secure. I started by changing the locks on my doors and windows. I also installed a security system, complete with cameras and an alarm. I made sure to keep my doors locked at all times, even when I was home. I also avoided staying out late, especially if I was alone. Despite these precautions, I still felt a sense of unease. The memory of the intruder was still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they might return. I was constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting the worst. It took me a long time to recover from the ordeal. I sought counseling to help me cope with the trauma of the experience. I learned to manage my anxiety, to recognize the signs of stress, and to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. It was a terrifying experience that has changed me in many ways. It has made me more cautious, more aware, and more resilient. It has taught me the importance of staying safe and the value of human connection. I went camping in Utah for a weekend getaway. It wasn't anything special. I hiked up to a small lake and planned to stay overnight. When I got there, it was more crowded than I'd hoped. There were two groups near the beach, but it wasn't too crowded. Around 5 p.m., both groups started packing up and left within the hour. With the beach to myself and an hour of sunlight left, I quickly changed into my swimsuit and jumped into the lake. I was only in there for about 10 minutes when I looked back at the campsite. The woods were calm, the sun was setting, but past the beach, a little ways into the forest, someone was watching me. They were too far away to see clearly, but it was definitely a man, and he was definitely looking at me. As soon as I caught him looking, he turned his head and walked further into the trees. It was creepy. Was it just a guy from one of the groups who forgot something? Or maybe a hiker I happened to catch looking at an awkward time? The way he just stopped and stared directly at me was unnerving. I walked back up to the beach and over to my tent. I dried off and kept my head on a swivel, scanning the forest for the man. I cooked a small meal and continued to look around for him. An hour passed, and there were no sightings. I figured I was good. I stayed up fairly late, at least a couple of hours after sunset, mostly looking up at the stars and resting. It sounds boring, but it's actually really nice. After a while, I got into my tent and laid on my sleeping mattress. The hike up must have made me tired because I fell asleep quickly. As soon as I woke up, I felt off. It was the middle of the night, pitch black inside the tent. All I could hear were insects chirping outside and a calm breeze blowing against the walls. I lay there for a while, my eyes open but unable to see anything. Then, my eyes started to adjust. I could see faint outlines of things inside my tent. As I moved my eyes around, they fell on the zipper. The tent flap was open, and between the opening was a shape. I stared at it for 4 or 5 seconds, my heart rate spiking. My vision became clear enough to make out a pair of eyes looking into mine. Adrenaline flooded through me, and my instincts took over. I grabbed my can of bear spray, shot it right at the opening, and yelled. I heard him yell and footsteps moving away from the tent. I started tearing up and coughing. I fumbled through my backpack to get my pocket knife, ready to fight for my life. But the man was gone. I didn't know which direction he went, but I didn't waste any time. The encounter had left me shaken and terrified. I was alone in the wilderness, vulnerable and exposed. The thought of the man lurking outside my tent, his intentions unknown, sent shivers down my spine. I tried to calm myself down, to focus on the present moment, but the fear was too strong. I knew that I had to get out of there, that I couldn't stay in the tent for another second. I gathered my things as quickly as I could, my hands trembling with fear. I used my handheld GPS to lead me back to the car, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the intruder. As I walked through the woods, I felt a sense of dread and vulnerability. I was at the mercy of the elements, and I was completely alone. I prayed that I would make it back to my car safely, that I would not be attacked again. I finally reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the man standing there, but there was nothing. I was safe, for now. But the experience had left a lasting mark on me. I would never forget the fear, the terror, the feeling of being completely alone and helpless. It was a lesson in survival, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the wilderness. I called the police to report the incident, but they were unable to find any trace of the man. I gave them a detailed description of him and his van, but they had no leads. I was left feeling frustrated and helpless, but I knew that I had done everything I could. The memory of that night haunted me for weeks. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I was constantly on edge. I was afraid to go outside, afraid to be alone. I felt like I was living in a constant state of fear. I sought counseling to help me cope with the trauma of the experience. I learned to manage my anxiety, to recognize the signs of stress, and to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. It was a terrifying experience that has changed me in many ways. It has made me more cautious, more aware, and more resilient. It has taught me the importance of staying safe and the value of human connection. I called the police to come out and take me home because my eyes were burning from the bear spray. They didn't find anything, but I don't know how much they searched. Whoever that was and what they wanted, I honestly couldn't tell you. With the image of that guy staring into my tent burned into my head, I won't be camping again for a long time. I worked at a gas station for several years. This night was like any other. I came in at 8 p.m., took over from the day worker, and the first couple of hours were busy with customers. Between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m., it slowed down, and the shift started to drag. I tried to keep myself busy by stocking shelves. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into the parking lot and parked in the spaces by the entrance door. A few other cars had come through recently, but usually, people just got gas quickly. Rarely would someone park in the spaces and come into the store this late. I stood up straight, tried to shake off the tiredness, and expected them to come in. A couple of minutes went by, and they didn't. I leaned over the counter, looked out the glass door, but couldn't see anything. The reflections on the door blocked any view of their car. Maybe they were taking a break from a long drive. I didn't care too much and sat back down, pulling out my phone. I spaced out reading articles for about 20 minutes. During that time, I didn't hear or see anything. Eventually, I looked up from my phone, and my heart almost stopped. A man was inside the store, standing in one of the aisles, looking right at me. His eyes darted away as soon as I saw him. He looked like he was in his mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket and a scruffy beard. I never saw or heard him enter. How did he get in while my mind was racing? I watched the man keep walking around, glancing over at me a few times. As soon as I looked away, after just 30 seconds, he hurried towards the front door and ran outside. I got up and ran to look out. The car was still there, but the guy walked past it and out onto the road. I couldn't see him anymore. I immediately went to the cameras to see how he got in and figure out what was going on. It only took a minute to find the footage of him slowly and quietly getting out of the car and going to the back of the gas station. The footage showed him walking around the back of the gas station for several minutes, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He seemed to be searching for something, his eyes scanning the area with a determined intensity. He disappeared from view for a few seconds, likely ducking behind the building or hiding in the shadows. A few moments later, he reappeared and walked back towards the front of the gas station. He entered the store without being seen or heard, his movements smooth and efficient. It was as if he had been practicing his entry for days, perfecting every detail. The man's behavior was both strange and suspicious. His stealthy movements, his deliberate actions, and his apparent familiarity with the gas station suggested that he had been planning his intrusion for some time. He had clearly chosen this particular gas station for a reason, and he had carefully studied its layout and security measures. It was as if he had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike, a moment when the gas station would be empty and vulnerable. He had clearly chosen this particular night, when the traffic had slowed down and the store was nearly deserted. He had entered the store through the back door, taking advantage of the fact that it was never locked. The man's intentions were unclear, but it was clear that he had something planned. He had been lurking around the gas station, waiting for the right moment to act. His presence had filled me with a sense of unease, a feeling that something was not quite right. I had been on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the worst. I was relieved that he had not attempted to rob the store or harm me. However, the fact that he had been lurking around the gas station, his intentions unknown, was deeply unsettling. I couldn't help but wonder what his plans had been, and what he would have done if he had decided to go through with them. There were no cameras back there, but those doors were never locked since the gas station was technically always open. What's really odd is that there were 15 minutes between the time he went around to the back and the time he walked out onto the sales floor. The police came to help me investigate. They ultimately found the car he left in to be a stolen vehicle from months ago. They didn't know anything about the guy or his motives. Sneaking around, he clearly had something else intended for that night. I think I was really lucky that for one reason or another, he decided not to go through with it. This happened a long time ago when I was 13. It was summer, and I spent most of the day playing on my PS3 or watching TV. Sometimes I'd go outside or hang with friends, but it was raining that day, so I was hunkered down inside. My dad always worked until 10 p.m., and my mom was a nurse, so her schedule was all over the place. Most of the day, I was playing on the PS3. Around 7 p.m., I went to the kitchen to make food. While I was in there, someone knocked on the front door. I didn't want to answer. As a kid, I was always nervous when someone was at the door. I waited a minute, hoping they would leave. After they knocked several more times, I snuck over to the door and looked out the peephole. I was confused and alarmed to see a police officer standing on our porch. He was looking around and waiting for me to answer. I felt a surge of fear wash over me as I realized that a police officer was standing at my front door. I had never seen a police officer in person before, and the sight of him standing there, his gun visible on his hip, sent a shiver down my spine. I felt like I was in trouble, that I had done something wrong. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I had to open the door, but I was also terrified of what might happen. I took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. The cold, wet air hit me in the face as I opened the door. The officer was standing there, his face etched with a serious expression. He was drenched from the rain, and his uniform was splattered with mud. I couldn't help but notice the gun on his hip. It was a large, intimidating weapon, and it made me feel even more scared. I had never seen a gun in person before, and the sight of it filled me with dread. The officer asked my name, and I replied in a small voice. He reassured me that everything was okay, that I didn't have anything to worry about. He tried to smile, but his teeth were noticeably rotting and yellow. This made me notice how unkempt he looked. Usually, cops were well put together, so this was off-putting. He noticed my hesitation and tried to speed up the conversation, saying he needed to search the home. I was terrified and confused, but I knew something was wrong. That's when I noticed there was no police car by my house, especially with the rain. All these red flags piled up, and just as he was starting to step forward, I slammed the door and locked it. He didn't even try to say anything else. He immediately slammed something against the door hard enough to shake the entire door and push me back a little. Thinking the door might give out, I ran to the home phone and dialed 911. I was freaking out so much, I'm surprised the operator even understood a word I said. The man outside didn't give up. He was still banging on the door when the actual police showed up. I heard him trying to convince them he was a real cop, but obviously, that didn't go well. He was taken in, and initially, my parents didn't tell me much about the charges, probably for my own safety. A few years later, they told me that during the interrogation, the man admitted to attempting to kidnap me. Had I been any more trusting, I don't know where I'd be right now.